And so I think sometimes the one thing that I would change would be for people to operate and also perhaps cross-pollinate reporting more. I think having a political beat can
Although that has its dangers too. You had the New York Times for 4 years saying, let's go talk to Trump voters in a diner, which didn't really work out for us either. That has
yeah, but it's all political reporting,
yes,
right?
That's true. So let's go beyond the Beltway. Gaza, in my view, has been a major media fail. Not just the failure to hold Israel to account for what it's doing, but the failure to humanize Palestinians on our screens. And today, in the opening monologue for my new show, I referenced an Intercept study which showed how the words massacre and slaughter are used almost exclusively for Israeli victims of Palestinian violence and not Palestinian victims of Israeli violence. And I happen to think that's not just dehumanizing, it's racist. And I wonder, A, do you agree with that? And B, do you think it's deliberately done?
I do think that that there absolutely is. I mean, institutional racism informs all our institutions. It is subconscious. It is foundational. That is what it is. And it's not to say that there is like this one individual that at the top of an organization that has explicit intent. It's just this, I mean, is coverage coverage leans misogynistic by default. It leans, you know, racist by default. The use of passive voice when a Palestinian is killed. The use of passive voice when a black person is killed by the police. Passive voice is reserved for the marginalized. And these practices are normalized. And so I think that who or what is deemed controversial is often at the core of these unjust decisions and coverage. You know, what is deemed controversial often tends to be issues relating to race, to gender. You know, these are what is seen as hot button, but half of our country is female. You know, and we have a huge plurality that are people of color.
It's interesting you mentioned the passive voice. That has been on display for the last 6 months. Like, there was a BBC headline about a man who lost, I think, 103 members of his family, and the headline was just, he lost 103 members of his family. Where did he lose them? Down the back of a couch? Like, tell us who killed them. And it took 33 paragraphs for the BBC to suggest Israel may have killed 103 members of his family. You were an early voice in Congress calling for a ceasefire. You did an interview with me on MSNBC in which you talked about war crimes in Gaza very early on, and you rightly won a lot of praise from pro-Palestinian activists for that. But some of them were upset that you didn't use the G word right at the start, the genocide. And then on March 22nd, you give this very fiery speech on the House floor in which you say, quote, if you want to know what an unfolding genocide looks like, open your eyes. How did you get to that point? How hard a decision was that for you to accuse Israel of genocide in Gaza, given how most of the rest of your congressional party are not with you on that issue, of course?
Well, you know, I think to me, this is not, and I know for most people, all people, this is not a term that is thrown around, that we throw around. We are talking about an accusation of atrocity on a scale that is not to be seen and should not be seen ever. But we're talking about a generational crime of massive scale. And that has very specific parameters of intent, of how it unfolds. And it also, I think, that conversation is also within the context of my role as a decision maker and how I try to operate and apply pressure to stop all of this from happening, and particularly halting the US enabling of this. And so for me, I believe that it was very important to speak to this, that I had to not say this to check off a box, but to create a legitimate, weighty argument that would have influence inside and outside. And after...
But right now,
yes.
As of right now, tonight, You believe the United States government, the Biden administration, is complicit in a genocide?
I believe that the ongoing famine that we are seeing and the forced famine of Gazans constitutes an unfolding genocide. And if we continue to enable the complete withholding of aid, the starvation of nearly 2 million people, this will be what have happened. And we've seen this in Rwanda,
Yes.
in Bosnia.
So you said in your speech, you referred to Joe Biden at the start as a decent man, but then later in the speech you said a genocide looks like, quote, decent people who do nothing or too little too late. Is that a reference to Joe Biden, that he's a decent man who is doing nothing or doing too little too late?
I think when we see how genocides unfold, they happen not just with intent, but they happen with exactly this kind of this almost invoking of uncertainty. We need to see more. We need to wait. No, it's not until it is too late.
Yes.
And when I think about my tipping point, that's part of what had compelled me, is that I did not, especially as we saw these reports come out about what the runway of famine would be, what the toll would be if we waited just days.
Yeah.
I had felt, I do not want to say this after it is done.
Okay.
Because then it will have been too late.
And you talked about enabling. Our enabling constitutes mainly arms sales. It's a big part of our enabling. Number one, did you ever imagine that Nancy Pelosi would come out for conditions on arms sales, of all people? And number two, post this weekend with the Iranian attack on Israel, what are you saying to colleagues who say, well, of course we have to arm Israel now? What are you saying to the Jared Moskowitzes and Josh Gottheimers?
Well, on your first note, I do think it's important for people to take a pause and realize how much of a dramatic sea change there has been. The mere notion or suggestion of conditioning U.S. military aid to Israel was unthinkable 7 months ago. Politically unthinkable. Never in the history of the United States have we had a conversation like this. And the fact that, as you mentioned, that even Nancy Pelosi is now signing on to letters about this, we have to understand this is a generational change.
Yeah.
Secondly, as to your second point, what we say to folks who resist this is that if we want safety in this region, we have to condition U.S. military aid, which we do to every country in the world, by the way. It's actually stopping the exemptions instead of creating one that we're talking about. And it's the creation of this exemption that has contributed, in my view, to destabilizing the region. Because when we say you can do anything you want with this, and as we've seen when there are leaders in the region who will do and will break international law and norms, we are having a hand in that. And the good news about it is that I do believe, I hope, that we are getting to a point where this is no longer a fringe position. More and more people are.
Do you worry that Israel, as a critic of Israel, do you worry that Israel is trying to start a war in the Middle East to distract from Gaza, trying to start a war with Iran? There was the attack on the consulate in Syria, which the Iranians claimed they were retaliating for. Mm-hmm. How worried are you about an Israel-Iran war that America gets dragged to, that Biden gets dragged into?
I can't speak to the intent. I don't know if it is volatile decision-making. It is difficult to generally get into the mind of not just one individual, but a cabinet, a government that has its own internal incentives as well, that they are responding